Okay, so that is the review of exam number 1. Okay, I sorry, I forgot to record that. I meant to do that. But does anybody have any questions about exam number 1? So I will hang out a little bit after class. I can't hang out too much because I have another meeting with a prospective candidate. But I will have a little bit of time after class. So if there are some questions about why you missed what you did, or just some clarifications of my comments, because um, yeah, sometimes my comments aren't always the easiest to read or understand, or just you want to talk about how you're doing in the class. I'm happy to wait around a little bit after class and talk to you, or we could set up an appointment to talk either later in the day or maybe after class tomorrow morning. All right. So just let me know, right? If you want to talk, I'm happy to talk with each and every one of you. So, okay. Well, in the time that we have left this afternoon, I want to go back and talk about inequality. Actually, before I jump into this, I do want to talk a little bit about tomorrow. What's going on tomorrow? We're going to do 2 things tomorrow. First off, we're going to begin talking about Chapter 12 on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Okay. Chapter 12 is one of the most important chapters in your book, right? It is really the basis for what we're going to spend the second half of class talking about. It's a model of the aggregate economy that we're going to use to begin thinking about how we can interpret the effects of both recessions and depressions, but also government policy. And so I very much want to encourage you to spend some time reading Chapter 12 tonight to get prepared for tomorrow's lecture, because it is such an important topic. And quite honestly, it's probably one of the more challenging chapters that we talk about in this class. So it's important, and it's also a little more challenging. And so the sooner that you can kind of, figure out what's going on in Chapter 12, the better you will be poised for doing well in the second half of this class. So very much want to encourage you to read through Chapter 12. We will talk about it tomorrow morning and a little bit tomorrow afternoon probably. But yeah, that's going to be the first thing we do tomorrow. So I really want to emphasize being prepared for tomorrow's class so that you can get the most out of our discussion as possible. The other thing we'll do tomorrow is we're going to take quiz number 3. And what's going to be on quiz number 3? 2 things. It's going to be on Chapter 9, which we talked about yesterday and today. I'm sorry, Monday and today. Chapter 9 on economic growth. So that will be on your quiz number 3. The other thing that will be on quiz number 3 is what we've talked about in terms of inequality, both this morning and this afternoon. Okay, so that will be the 2 big topics. Nothing on that we talk about tomorrow in Chapter 12 will be on the quiz tomorrow afternoon. Okay, so Chapter 12 will not be on the quiz, just Chapter 9 and our discussion of inequality. All clear? Everyone clear about what's going to be on the quiz, what we're going to do tomorrow? All right, so definitely spend a little bit of time tonight preparing for the quiz, but also don't forget to prepare for class tomorrow, because I really do think that you will find it useful to have read through Chapter 12 and be a little familiar. Sunny asks, is Chapter 10 on the quiz? No, that was on the first exam. So nothing from Chapter 10 is going to be on the quiz tomorrow. Okay. So let's go back and talk about inequality. Why has inequality risen in the United States? What can we say about this? Well, there is no one single reason. There is many things that are going on in the US economy that are contributing to this. In fact, I could probably come up with more than this, but there are probably at least 7 things that I would call substantial factors in why inequality has been risen in the United States. And so obviously, I want to introduce you, I want to talk about these 7 things. Once again, each one of these we could spend days talking about, right? There's so much to break down in terms of each one of these reasons. So I can't really get into depth or detail as much as I would like, but I think we can at least begin to understand the basic concepts, the basic insights about some of the big factors that have driven inequality in the US. The big one, or the first one, is actually a concept that we've talked about before, which we called the race between education and technology. The race between education and technology, or economists often refer to this as skills-based technological change. Skills-based technological change. What does that mean? What's true about the technological change that's going on in the US? It is skills-based, meaning the technology requires a certain set of skills to use. This has not always been true about technological change, right? Think back through history. One of the greatest technological inventions of all time is things like antibiotics. What was the nice thing about antibiotics? Pretty much anybody could benefit from it. Everybody benefited from it. How about germ theory and the idea of public sanitation? That was something that pretty much everybody benefited from. But how about information technology? Some jobs have changed dramatically, but other jobs haven't changed at all, right? I mean, if you think about yourself as a janitor or working in many service industries, your job hasn't changed. Your job would not change at all because of the internet, right? So some jobs have changed. What's true about those jobs that have changed? They tend to be very education intensive. In other words, the people who are benefiting the most from new technology tend to be more educated workers. So think about 2 labor markets. We have a low education labor market. This could be for, things like labor intensive skills. So here we are in the old days, where there's a kind of a low education labor market for more labor intensive jobs. And then there's another labor market for higher education jobs. And notice here, there's a wage differential between the two, right? There's a wage differential, that the high education labor market gets paid a higher wage than the low education market. However, what has happened with technology? Technology has fundamentally increased the demand for high education labor because you need to have the skills to use it. It's increased the demand for this kind of labor, but it has had very little impact on the demand for low-skilled workers. So this wage differential has gotten bigger. It's gotten bigger. Now, would it have to work out like this? Not necessarily. What if we could educate more workers? We could increase the supply and lower the wage differential, right? For instance, if we could increase the number of high education workers, we could increase this supply and shrink the wage differential. But here's the problem. We're just not doing it quickly enough. Yes, the supply of educated workers is going up, but it's not going up at nearly the rate as demand. And so this wage differential is getting bigger, right? This wage differential is getting bigger. So look what's happening here in our labor market. Okay, this is looking at wages for full-time male workers. Okay, full-time male workers. If we went back to the early 60s, we would see very little difference between those who had less than a high school education and those who had a bachelor's degree or more. Very small wage differentials. But what has happened here over the last 50 years? Those wage differentials have completely opened up, and particularly since the 1980s. Since the 1980s, we have seen a big increase in wages to those who have a bachelor's degree or even more, right? Even more than a bachelor's degree is where we've seen even some of the biggest increases in wages. Why is this? Because of skills-based technological change, right? The technology demands more education, and we simply are not producing enough workers to keep those wage differentials smaller. So looking to the future, is this going to continue? Yes. There's a lot of reasons to think that this is only speeding up. That any job that is essentially replicable could be eliminated, right? Any job that does not involve creativity and cannot be and is not replicable could be eliminated. Well, when you think about it like that, you see why having an education is so important, right? when the job asks for creativity and doing something different all the time, it's really asking for somebody that has a wide range of skills. And where do you develop those? Well, in part, you develop them through getting a higher education, right? And so this process is one that is going to continue, right? And it is undoubtedly playing a big role in inequality. Now, what do you do about this? That's not clear, right? Should we, I mean, it would be great if we could educate more workers, right? But, you know, outside of that, it's not 100% clear what do you do about this? I mean, we don't want to stop technology. We like new technologies, right? They provide us with many benefits. But one of the things that technology is doing is it's also increasing inequality, right? In part because we're not creating enough educated workforce to keep up with the higher demand for technology. Now, this is related to a second idea. And in fact, many of these ideas are very closely related, or these factors are closely related. The second factor the increasing importance of what economists call intangible capital. I'm just writing a whole bunch of stuff here. Even all this stuff I'm writing is not a complete list. But intangible capital really refers to the tools that people work with, but they're tools that you can't touch. Increasingly, people work with intangible tools. They work with ideas, networks, organizations, supply chains. Companies have developed training procedures, intellectual property, software, branding, decision systems. We are moving towards a weightless world, a weightless economy, where more and more of what we produce is not tangible. It is intangible. It is ideas, processes, networks. It's not the old school manufacturing-based economy that many people think about. So we're moving to basically an ideas-based economy. Well, what's the implication of this? One of them is you need an education to use these things, right? I mean, this is, if you don't have a high school education, it's really hard to understand modern supply chains. You need education, you need training, you need experience. Those are kind of prerequisites for these kind of things. Not everyone's going to have access to it. This kind of world is also going to drive a lot of monopolies. Why? Because when you develop a better idea than everybody else, you have a chance to monopolize a market. And maybe I want to back up here and just be clear. When I talk about something like intangible capital, I'm talking about firms that even firms that produce physical goods are becoming more intangible based, right? Let me give you an example of this. Starbucks. Okay, what is Starbucks? Starbucks is really an idea. I mean, yes, they make you coffee, right? And they have production systems for making coffee. But really, Starbucks is as much about coffee as it is consistency, an organization, a product platform, a branding, training, right? Having creativity, creative materials, right? Giving you a sense of place when you're there, right? I mean, they are as much an ideas company as they are about making coffee. And that is the way that our economy is increasingly moving, right? And so, what that means is that for companies that have these ideas that people like, there's going to be a strong chance of a monopoly. And that's one of the reasons why, as we've moved more toward this weightless world, it does appear like there's more of a chance of a monopoly. One other implication is it's very hard to tax this stuff. What do we see about all of these IT companies? They pay very little taxes. And part of the reason is because where do they produce? They produce wherever they want. Their ideas. So it's not like Ford, where you know where they're making cars, right? Google is creating ideas, but they have offices and branches all across the globe. And they will use that to move profits around to places where they don't have to pay taxes. And so that is one of the big, as we're going to talk about policy here in a minute, one of the reasons why taxes on the rich and corporate taxes have gone down is simply because it's becoming increasingly hard to tax some of these corporations.
So I have a question. So like if you're a business owner, could you just make like another LLC in a different country and then like as a consulting firm and then pay yourself for consulting services? Or,
So Zach, I'm not an accountant, so I cannot tell you. Let me tell you, in practice, yes, many people do that. Now, whether that is officially legal or not, because there are laws about how you can move profits around. But one of the biggest problems here is we really do not have an international tax code, right? And so essentially some countries essentially write their tax laws in ways that make it very easy for people to hide profits in their country, right? The Caribbean is famous for this. So yeah, some countries make it easy to do, and then other countries, right, they push up against the letter of the law. Now, in terms of your exact example, I mean, I'm not a tax accountant, so I don't know. But I do know that in practice, companies do this a lot. They do this a lot. Whether it's technically legal or not, they do this a lot. Okay, globalization is leading to more inequality. We know that the US has comparative advantage in education-intensive goods. But one of the things we know is that international trade does create losers. And who are those losers? They are typically less educated Americans who do not have access to the new jobs that are being created and are losing their old jobs because they're moving to other countries where they do have comparative advantage and less education intensive production. This is part of the whole concept of global supply chain. Okay, one of the things I really want to, we'll touch on this a number of times here over the next couple of weeks, is this whole idea about what is an import and what is an export is a really outdated idea. Because in essence, goods are being made everywhere and nowhere at once. Okay, I'm going to give you a specific example of this when we look at Apple iPads. But everybody thinks about Apple iPads as being made in China. That's absolutely not true. Apple iPads are finished in China. In other words, the last stage of production takes place in China. But in reality, an Apple iPad is made in between 15 and 25 different countries. And so what makes an import and what makes an export is no longer nearly as clear, right? I have been talking about international trade as if countries specialize in goods. That's increasingly not so clear anymore. Countries don't specialize in goods. Or at least not in final goods. They specialize in stages of production. So for instance, if you just think of a good, the beginning process that might be very labor intensive might take place in Vietnam. At the same time, some of the more high-tech parts of it might be taking place in South Korea and Canada. The ideas for the good might be taking place in the United States. Then all of these things will come together in China, where they will be put together in terms of a final good and then moved on from there. As economists, we'd say, oh, well, that's an export from China. But in reality, it's not an export from China, right? China just contributed the final stage of production, but by nowhere near the only stage of production. But you can see from my example where the more that you can build goods everywhere and nowhere, the more that it puts an emphasis here in the United States on having skills that are demanded globally. And these tend to be the more educated, more creative kind of jobs, and they tend not to be the more labor-intensive, less educated kind of jobs. And so globalization is just really, magnifying the effects of the first two things that we talked about, right? That the current economy is really great for educated people, but it's not so great for those who are less educated and don't have unique skills. This can be taken to the extreme when we look at the very top of the distribution. What are we seeing at the very, very top of the distribution? Well, this is often referred to as the economics of superstars, okay? Because we're talking about a small number of people here, right? Basically, people making more than $1.3 million a year. They are seeing their incomes booming. What's true about the people in this group? What's amazing is how few different jobs they have. They tend to come in these industries: entertainment, sports, technology, law, and finance. They come from a kind of an amazingly small number of jobs. There's no college professors in this group. Well, maybe there is one or two, but there's not very many. What's the deal with these people? Why are their incomes booming so much? Well, here's what's likely going on. If you take globalization and then you add to it a unique skill, what do you get? A potentially huge return to being what we'll call the best. And I should add in here information technology, right? If you take globalization and information technology and you have a unique skill, what you get is a huge return to essentially being best. All right, so, thinking about like Tom Cruise, okay? Tom Cruise, for the new Mission Impossible movie I was reading, is going to be paid more than $50 million for this movie. All right, is Tom Cruise worth $50 million? Well, let's say from an artistic viewpoint, I would say no. But from an economic standpoint, is he worth $50 million? Probably. Why? Did Humphrey Bogart or did John Wayne get paid $50 million for a movie? No. But of course, the market for movies back in that era is something much different than the market today, right? Because you're not just making a movie to be shown in movie theaters in the United States. Today, you're making a movie to be shown globally, across the globe, in China, in Europe, in North America, South America. It's got to be not just draw people into movie theaters. It's got to be draw people streaming. You've got to sell McDonald's Happy Meals for it. You got to sell T-shirts, right? The movie business is so much more than just movies and movie theaters, right? And so when you are the best, when you are a name like Tom Cruise, getting Tom Cruise into your movie is probably worth that kind of crazy money. Likewise, LeBron James is probably worth more than the crazy money that he makes, right? Because when you are a name, when you have that unique skill set, there is a huge return to being best. And what if you're second best or third best? Your return might be significantly lower, right? I mean, we know the Olympics are coming this summer. What happens to the person who wins the 100-yard dash or 100-meter dash? They're a global name. What happens to the person that finishes second? Nobody knows them. How much slower is the person who finishes second? 0.05 of a second, right? That's the difference between the two. And yet there's a huge return to being best. These kind of economics are definitely driving up the returns to some jobs, right? And particularly to some individuals who essentially can take advantage of the economics of superstars, right? And so we see this in finance and in law, in tech, sports and entertainment, right? Those are the big areas where we're seeing this, where some of these economics of superstars are the biggest. All right. Now it's time to blame you guys. One of the reasons why inequality is going up is because it is increasingly true that we marry people who are a lot like us, particularly in terms of education. Now, it's interesting to think about this, but that has not always been the case. One of the really interesting things here is that assortative mating is basically a relatively new phenomenon. In part, this is because if we went back, 50, 70 years ago, most women did not work. Most women did not get an education. And so if we went back to the 1950s, you'd see very little correlation between the education of a man and the education of his partner, or the education of a woman and the education of her partner. But increasingly, what we're seeing is that the partners of educated people tend to also have more education. And the partners of less educated people tend to have less educated children. The same goes for wealth. There is a very strong correlation between the wealth of partners who marry. So we usually think about inequality on a household basis. What this is doing is this is magnifying household inequality, right? The income of households, because we increasingly have households where two people both work and both make very good money. But it's also playing a deeper role in inequality. And that deeper role is how we raise our children. And here, there is so much evidence that there is a big difference between how households with an educated mother or households with two parents that are educated raise children much differently than from households where both parents are not educated, or particularly when the mother is not educated. Once again, there's lots of research here. Let me just talk about a couple of things. There's research that high educated parents talk with their children 3 hours more a week than less educated parents. Right? They talk to their children more. High educated parents tend to spend more time negotiating with their children as opposed to laying down arbitrary rules, right? Mothers that do not have a college degree spend more time working, and as a result, spend roughly about 30 minutes less a day with their children. So regardless of what they're doing, women without an education spend more time working and less time with their kids. Something we also know is that if you look at divorce rates, they're strongly correlated with education. That two-parent households increasingly are two parents that both have a higher education. A woman without a college degree is 5 times more likely to be an unpartnered mother than a woman with a college education. Right? Let me say that again. A woman without a college degree is 5 times more likely to be an unpartnered mother than a woman with a college degree. This just has profound implications for the way that we raise kids, the way that we organize our lives, the social safety net that both kids and parents are a part of, the set of privileges, whether educational or income or wealth or insurance, right? It just goes on and on, right? It just goes on and on. And so this is a fundamental cause of our inequality. And one of the things that this is doing is this is reducing that intergenerational mobility. We would love to blame our education system on the fact that we are not getting as many educated workers as we need. But the problem is, if you actually look at our education system, the inequality is already there by the time the kids get into our education system. Now, you can say our education system is not doing enough to reduce the inequality, and I would agree, right? We are not doing enough to reduce inequality. But the inequality in educational attainment is already there in kindergarten, right? It's already there in kindergarten. And where's that coming from? It's coming from households and the way that people live their lives. And a lot of this is just this complicated net of privilege and advantage that comes with having an education and having wealth. And quite honestly, many of these things are associated with outright discrimination and racial bias here, as we're going to talk about in a minute. So yeah, I mean, this is really important.
I think that's the number one determining factor. They were talking. I had a high school teacher that talked about this. He said the number one determining factor of how well a kid does in school is how much do parents make. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know.
I had actually heard, I haven't checked the data recently, but I actually had heard that the number one determining factor of how well a kid does in school is what's the education level of their mother. That is the strongest predictor of how well you do in school, right? But partly it's, of course, having an educated mother helps you have an educated kid, but it's also that when you have an educated mother, it brings a whole network of privilege with it, right? In many ways. Some of them, the ways we're talking about here, right? A mother with a college education is more likely to have a partner, right? A married partner and a more stable income and, all these things. So, yeah. And, when you begin to think about this, you begin to think about how hard it is to change these things too, right? I mean, there's not like some sort of simple policy prescription for just changing this all up. I mean, this is a complicated business. All right. Then we should also be clear that there is a vicious circle, or I should say a vicious cycle. It's probably a better way of saying it. There is a vicious cycle between the power of elites and inequality. The rich have more power. And what do they do with that power? They use the power to change the rules in their favor. This has always been true, particularly in democracies. This is one reason, to go back to what we talked about this morning, why political theorists have argued so much that having a solid middle class is important for having a functioning democracy. We need elites, right? We need the skills they have, but what happens when you give elites too much power? They began to use that power to change the rules to their favor. And so you need to balance that power. And how do you do that? With a strong middle class, with a middle class that's willing to vote these people out of power. But it's pretty clear that inequality has increased the power of elites who use that power to change the rules to make them richer. Right? The more power and money you have, the more power and money that you're getting because you're changing the rules. I just want to pick two examples. The first is our political process. It's hard to argue that the rules aren't being shaped by money in the United States. In the US, voter participation is closely correlated with your income. The richer you are, the more likely you are to vote. Campaign contributions are extremely closely correlated with income. You won't be surprised to find out that that top 0.01% that we talked about, the superstars, they contributed more than 50% of campaign funding in the 2020 election. So you're getting the rich that have more power. The poor have less power. This has led to political polarization, right? Where once again, without that strong middle class that kind of binds us all together, we're getting more conflict. We see this not just at the political level, but we see this in racism and discrimination too. Right? There are many, many examples of the ways that white people who have most of the wealth, most of the political power, have changed the rules in their favor, right? We could talk about this once again for days, right? Let me just kind of talk about one example of this that may or may not be relevant to your life, which is that many studies have shown that whites and blacks have the same rate of drug use in the United States. But if you are a black person, you are 5 times more likely to go to jail for a drug-related offense than if you are a white person, right? There are a lot of reasons for that. Formal rules in criminal sentencing and informal rules, such as the power of whiteness, the power of having wealth, the power of being able to get better lawyers, right? So, this, you just simply can't argue this, right? You go back to our facts this morning, right? How do you explain out of, 2,000 plus billionaires, there's only 10 black people or 10 black billionaires? It's undoubtedly some of this is racism. And so, once again, there's been many economic studies that have talked about the way that racism, and sometimes it's not explicit racism, it's implicit racism, factors into our hiring processes, factors into our decisions about who goes to jail and who doesn't go to jail, factors into who becomes a judge and who doesn't become a judge, or who becomes a police officer, who doesn't. Listen, all of us, right? All of us. This is, in many ways, when we talk about this, I think some people feel a sense of judgment. I don't think that we should feel a sense of judgment, in the sense that all of us have our at least implicit racial biases, right? The key is, to what extent are we going to recognize them and do something about them, right? To what extent are we going to continue to let the rules be shaped by elites, right? The more that we let the rules be shaped by the elites, the more we're going to have the problem with this inequality. And the more that we're going to have a problem having institutions that keep our economy and our society together, right? All right, one last thing I'll talk about. Something called patrimonial capital. Patrimonial capital, I think we can understand this pretty easily. What does compounding mean? the wealthy will get wealthier, right? Because if you have wealth, what does that mean? Your wealth can compound over time. If you don't have wealth, then your wealth won't compound over time. I know that most of us are first year students, or even the sophomores in here. You took the first year seminar class last year. One of the things that you talked about was redlining, right? Which was the explicitly setting rules in certain urban areas that prohibited people of color from getting loans and mortgages to buy houses. Housing has been one of the great ways of increasing wealth for Americans. You buy a house, you live in it for 20 or 30 years, and that house appreciates in value, right? Today, roughly about 40% of household wealth is tied up in your house. But the problem is that many people were systematically excluded from owning a house, or at least owning a house in an area where the house was going to appreciate, right? The only place they could buy a house was a house in a bad neighborhood where people couldn't get loans, and through segregation were surrounded by other people that were disadvantaged by the system. And so this is a huge reason why many people, particularly people of color, do not have nearly the amount of wealth that we see that a typical white family has. And the problem is then that this difference compounds over time. The wealthy get wealthier because their wealth accumulates. And so many of you might have heard of this book by Thomas Piketty called Capital, in which he kind of explores this in about 700 or 800 pages, right? It's a little much for most of us. But he actually kind of traces the role of compounding over time and finds this to be a very important part of the reason why inequality in wealth occurs. It's simply compounding, and not everybody is able to take advantage of it. All right, well, there's a lot more to be said about inequality and why it's happening. But I would like to say just a couple of things about, well, why does this all matter, right? Why the hell do we care? Maybe, maybe you're a biologist and you're like, well, survival of the fittest and life isn't fair, whatever. Some people are rich and some people are poor, and, that's the way the world works. To that, I would like to argue that it's not nearly that simple, that all of us are losing in important ways because of inequality. When we talk about productivity, it's a communal idea, meaning it's not just what you make and what I make, but it's based on community. It's based on networks. It's based on networks of physical capital, human capital, and technology. There is no such thing as individual productivity unless you're Robinson Crusoe living on that desert island. For the rest of us, we rely on other people. We rely on networks and other people. And what does this mean? There's a cost to all of us. There's a cost to all of us when some people are excluded from these networks, whether due to poverty or due to segregation or discrimination. When some people who have skills that can contribute are kept from contributing, there is a cost to all of us for that. So productivity is this communal thing. And it's not just the people who are poor that are losing. It's really all of us that are losing in some way, shape, or form. The second reason why this hurts all of us is that fairness inherently matters to us as individuals, as people. Now, we all have different definitions of fairness, but one of the things that we know is that fairness matters to people. That when they feel like they're not being treated fairly, that matters. So, I don't know if any of you ever heard about something called the ultimatum game. If you ever done this experiment, maybe in a psychology class or whatever. But this is a common game that economists like to play. And so here's the game. You have two people, okay? One person one has $10 or $100. We'll just say it's $10. And so the game is person one who has the $10 has to offer a certain amount of that money to person two. Person two then has two choices. They can say, I accept that offer, and then they divide the money up. Or person two can say no, and nobody gets anything. Okay? So do we understand the game? So person one makes an offer of the $10, some part of the $10, and then person two either says, yes, I accept that, or no, I don't accept anything. Okay, you budding economists. How does an economist say you should play the ultimatum game? What should be, if you're the first person, the person with the $10, what should be your offer to the second person? What's the rational offer? Zach says 50-50. Logan says 5. Zach, you are way too nice of a guy to be an economist. So are you, Logan. Faith says 1. Yeah, I'm going to go lower. 1 penny. You offer 1 penny to the second person. Why? Because isn't 1 penny better than nothing? The second person should accept any offer because their alternative is to get nothing. But in fact, when you play this game, what happens if you offer that second person 1 penny? What do they say? Screw you. I'm going to take less to make sure you take less, right? It's a matter of fairness that people have this notion, this strong inbred belief that if you screw me, I'm going to screw you because it's not fair. It's not fair, right? And so economists have actually played this game across the world and have found that it's closely correlated with all sorts of measures of trust, but also of economic productivity. That in countries where people don't trust each other and feel like the world is unfair, they actually have worse outcomes. And so that's the thing that I'm trying to convey here, is that fairness, at least perceived fairness, impacts trust. And trust impacts economics. Trust, in some sense, you could think of as the lubricant of economics. The more that we can trust each other, the more that we can trade. And that, of course, is one of the dangers about inequality, is that inequality is leading to less trust and more polarization. The final thing I'll say here is that we worry about inequality because today's inequality is fueling tomorrow's inequality. As I said this morning, maybe we wouldn't be so worried about inequality if we really thought that a poor kid today had a good chance of becoming rich when they got older. But in fact, we know that inequality today is reducing intergenerational inequality. So let me just, I'm sorry, I'm really running late. I hate to go over, particularly in the afternoon, but let me just show you a couple of pieces of data just to kind of illustrate this for you. Where is it? Okay, here's a kind of an amazing graph. This is the correlation between a parent's income and the chance that their kid will go to college. Pretty amazing correlation there, right? Between a parent's income and the chance that a kid goes to college. And we know that going to college is the key to increasing your income in this modern economy. And so the fact that there is such a strong correlation between college attendance and parent income does not bode well for future intergenerational mobility. And we see this if we look across countries. This curve is sometimes called the Great Gatsby curve, right? If you ever read Great Gatsby, right? Gatsby is the poor guy who becomes rich. So this is actually just a measure of intergenerational mobility across countries. What's the chance that a poor person will move up to a higher income distribution than their parents? And what's the chance that somebody in a high income class will move down over their life? So on the vertical axis here, it says less mobility. So this is kind of a weird graph. A higher number on the vertical axis means less mobility. And on the right axis is inequality. So what do we see? Countries with more inequality have less mobility, like the US and the UK, right? The US has a high level of inequality and a low level of mobility. What countries tend to do it right? Well, these Northern European countries, right? Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, right? Doing a much better job of not only keeping inequality low, but making sure that there's more intergenerational mobility. All right, so, you know, I always worry when I get to the end of this that everybody is like so unbelievably depressed now about the state of the world that you're not going to be able to function. Listen, that is certainly not the point of this, right? Because if I can actually go back to I think the first graph I showed you today, right? When I looked at the Gini coefficient, and notice here, the US actually had a long period of relatively lower inequality, right? Back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, right? It's not impossible for the US to do things about this, right? I'm not going to say that these things are easy, but it's not impossible. Partly it means a big change in government policy. Partly it means those dirty words in politics, which is income redistribution. And even more than income redistribution, it means opportunity redistribution. To think about making sure that opportunity is more evenly distributed. So, you know, I don't want you to be completely depressed, right? And if we had more time to talk about this, I'd love to talk more about policy and policies that could work and maybe policies that wouldn't work. But I will say that economists are thinking about this a lot, and that I don't think that it's completely depressing, right? There are things that could work, right? We see other countries doing it. It's just a question of whether we want to do it or not, whether we have the political will and the ability to do it. So, all right, I kind of talked long here. Went all the way to 2 o'clock. That's hard in the afternoon, particularly after your exam. So I appreciate all of your attendance and attention today. So remember, tomorrow we're going to pick up in chapter 12. So do make sure that you read carefully through chapter 12. Also prepare for quiz number 3, right, which is going to be on chapters 9 and on this stuff that we talked about on inequality, okay? All right, I'm going to hang around for a couple of minutes if anybody wants to talk about your exam, but if not, I'll see you in the morning, okay? Have a good one, everyone.